Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. Hope you had a good weekend. Did you get some rest? Are you sure? Today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about rest. And I don't just mean sleep. I mean actual spiritual, physical, emotional, and other types of rest. And to do this, we have not just someone who's written a fabulous book, which she has, but we have a doctor. Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith is with us live right now, and we're going to talk about this issue of rest because I suspect that it maybe impacts us more than we realize. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us. How serious, how big of an issue is rest in most people's lives?
It's huge. I mean, really now since COVID and the lock-in and everything that's happened, it's really become really more prevalent to people and really more obvious that we're having a difficult time learning how to rest well as how to sleep well, because really they're not the same thing. I know many of us, we think about sleep and rest as being the same thing, but they're two completely different compartments. And because so many people can't sleep well, we're seeing a lot more increase in anxiety and depression and all the different symptoms that come from sleep deprivation and rest deficits.
A lot of people who are, achievers. I know my dad. He's very much an A type, and it's funny because I'll be like, you've been off the last 3 days, but he'll be like, I just can't rest. What's going on with people that are motivated, that are driven, that even when they sleep, they don't feel like they're restful?
Well, that's the thing. High achievers have learned how to produce, even if they're producing out of their fatigue and not out of a full or really healthy place. And so what I try to help people to understand is that just because you're a high producer, you always have to look at, am I producing from my best place, where I feel mentally sharp, where my energy is good, where my attitude is good, my motivation's up. Because what I find is a lot of leaders, because they're so accustomed to the fatigue of producing, that they think that's just the norm, that they always have to feel in this place of, I'm tired all the time, because you hear people say that all the time. I'm always tired, I'm always in need of more rest, and there just isn't enough time for rest. And the reality is, for most people, it's not about trying to carve out huge blocks of time to make yourself rest. It's learning some simple techniques on how to do restorative type activities in the middle of their busy day, not after they take a vacation, because how often do we take vacation? Not very much. And so you don't want that to be the only time you feel refreshed and revived and energized. You want it to be something that's sustainable.
Okay, so you mentioned vacation. I just came back from a vacation a little over a week ago. And I'm the type that when I go on vacation, I don't sleep a whole lot. And in fact, this last vacation was hiking in national parks in southern Utah, and it was exhausting. I came back sore, but yet I felt refreshed. What is there any correlation, between how do I say this? It's not like rest simply means staying away from physical exertion. Sometimes it can be getting the physical activity, but it's just like it's the release on your mind.
Mm-hmm. You hit it. You've nailed exactly the problem that most people have. Many of us think of rest as the cessation of activity. We think of it as stopping. We think of it as sleeping, breaking away, taking a break. But really, rest is about restoration. Those two words should go hand in hand when you're thinking about it. And so when we're looking at rest, what I start people off with is just the understanding that there's more than just one thing when you think about rest. There's actually 7 different types of rest. And so I love your example that you gave with going hiking, because one of the types of rest that creative people who are innovative or thinking outside of the box, always kind of looking at different ways to approach life and approach topics, have a tendency to have a creative rest deficit, because that's the area they're always pulling from and they're drawing from in their work. Well, creative rest is the rest we receive when we allow ourselves to appreciate beauty in whatever form that is. It could be natural beauty, like like the mountains or the ocean or the woods or hiking, or it can be man-made beauty, like going to an art museum or listening to music or the symphony. And so you actually described creative rest in that that's an area where you pull from your resources and your gifting during the day, during your normal work week, but you need to be filled back up in that area. And so that includes doing something out in nature that, although still physical, when you finish it, you could be physically tired, but creatively and mentally and sometimes even spiritually restored if you received rest in all those areas.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for explaining it so well, because that's exactly what goes on with me. In fact, as I've just finished a book, it's not out yet, but oftentimes the hardest thing to do is sit in front of a computer screen and try to write. But man, if I'm hiking, even if I'm working in the yard, or I like to bike, if I'm biking, I won't be thinking about the book,
Mm-hmm.
but that's when the best ideas come. And yeah, okay. So you
Yeah, your creativity is getting restored. And that's
yeah.
the beautiful thing about creativity, creative rest, is that we serve a creative God. And for most of us, we don't think about the things we do as being creative sometimes because, sometimes you're not writing a book or writing a musical score or painting or doing something that you automatically think of as creativity. But business owners are having to be creative. Marketing people have to be creative. Teachers have to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming up with a lesson plan for an auditory learner versus a visual learner, you've got to be creative. So many of us pour out of our creativity, and then we try to get that restored because we feel tired or drained. We try to restore it by going to sleep, which is in no way going to improve your creativity. It may help other areas of your life, but it's not going to improve your creativity. You have to pour back into the place of the deficit. That's the key.
Thank you for explaining my life. You mentioned 7 types of rest, and we just covered one of them. What's another one that affects people on a routine basis?
Yeah, well, I'll name all 7 just so people kind of get a sense for them. The 3 that most people are aware of are the physical, mental, and spiritual. So most people have at least heard of those 3 in some form or another. And then the 4 that are lesser known are the emotional, social, sensory, and creative. And so one that I find a lot of people struggle with is the one that specifically deals with emotional rest, particularly now because a lot of us are experiencing feelings we've never felt before. People who have never been anxious are starting to feel a little anxious. Just the stress and pressure of the unknown and uncertainty creates a bit of a emotional response for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to be a normally fearful or anxious person to start feeling kind of some of the weight of that uncertainty of just how things are right now. And so what emotional rest does is the rest that comes when we feel the freedom to be able to be very authentic and vulnerable and real in how we express ourselves to others. And what I find is a lot of people, because either we are in leadership or we are in a situation where we want to not let people fully into kind of what we're feeling and what's going on with us, we'll have a tendency to keep those feelings to ourselves. And what happens with that is if you're always holding in your true emotions and there's no one that you feel is a safe place to be able to share that information with, it starts making you feel like there's something wrong with your emotions and in essence, something wrong with you. So you kind of feel like, well, people don't really know the real me. Nobody really knows who I really am at my core. And that's when I start seeing people dealing with more stressful issues like suicidal thoughts and depression and some of these deeper levels of mental health issues. Because when you feel like there's no one who really knows you at your core, you feel like there's something wrong with you at your core.
What's the solution for that?
Well, the best type of emotional rest is really, I think, is really shown in the life of Jesus. I think he gave us the best example of what that looks like. When you look at his life, we see these examples where he's ministering to the masses. We all have the masses in our life, whether that's a large mass or small mass, is those people we interact with on our day-to-day basis. And then we see in his life where he has a smaller group that he's interacting with, the 12. And the 12 knew more than the masses knew, but they didn't know everything. Because then you see this separated group of like the three. And I think the best example of that is on the Mount of Transfiguration, where you see the three get a fuller revelation of who he is above all those other groups that have had experiences with him. And at no point in time was Jesus ever inauthentic or trying to hide anything. It's just everybody doesn't need to know the fullness until it's time for them to know more about you. And so for leaders, if you're a pastor or if you're someone in ministry, I find I minister a lot in my field to pastors and ministry leaders specifically because this is a group that tends to not let people into that three.
Yeah.
Jesus had the three for a reason, and every ministry leader needs a few people who know when you're not okay or know deeper amounts of information about you. Like I said, in Jesus' example, at no point was he ever inauthentic or signs of depression, but there was a deeper level of him that others didn't know. And so as ministry leaders, we also need to have those people who know a little bit deeper about us. So if you're struggling in your marriage, does the whole church need to know that? No. But you need someone, because otherwise the pressure of keeping all of that hidden from everyone gets to be too much.
I can tell you, where do you think, other than you, I'm sorry, stumbling into this one, other than you, do you know where leaders who have reached the end of their rope, you know where they go? They go to my dad. And so I have lived a lifetime of seeing exactly what you're talking about, where a pastor's afraid to admit a weakness or a struggle for fear of losing his church, for fear of losing his reputation. And it's not just true for pastors, it's true for everyone. But when those emotions are bottled up, they become toxic. Man, you are so right on. Because go into another form of rest that affects a lot of people.
I would probably say the next biggest one would be mental rest. And I think because so many of us love information. We love information and we love kind of staying on top of things. And what I find for a lot of people is even when they want to sleep and get that high quality, deep stage 3 non-REM sleep that we all kind of really want, what happens is when they try to get it, they lay down at night and it's like their mind won't shut up.
Yeah.
Their thoughts are going and they're thinking about their to-do list, or they get this great revelation like right in the middle of the night, right before they're about to go to bed. And the thing with the mind is it automatically, if you keep ruminating over a thought, it will try to hold on to that thought, even at the expense of you sleeping. So you get this idea that, I need to make sure I do this thing the next morning. So, it's on your checklist. You're just trying to make sure you remember it. Your brain will hold on to that little bit of information all night long because it's afraid if it lets it go, then you won't remember it the next day. And so a simple way to undo that would be to kind of what we call brain dumping, or basically having something like a notepad or a journal or something that you can jot that bit of information down on. So that gives your brain permission to then let it go. So you can then get the sleep you need. I have a lot of people say, but Holy Spirit speaks to me like right at the middle of the night. Yes, I'm not telling you to ignore Holy Spirit. You write it down. Write it down.
Yeah.
So, because otherwise your brain has to take full responsibility for holding on to that information.
Yeah.
And that's not fair because it will hold on to it, but you won't get any rest that night either.
Again, story of my life. I will email myself if there's something I need to do that I think of when I am laying in bed. I'll just grab my phone and email myself, and you're exactly right. Then I let it go because I know that I'll see it the next day and take care of it. This is so good. This is so wonderful. Let me ask you this, because you talk about with the creative, especially. When we look at Scripture and we see after God, after creation, that God took a day of rest. Well, I mean, I think there's more than God. Well, I don't think God was tired. I think there's something that he was laying out. What do you see in that idea of taking either, you can call it a Sabbath, a day of rest is basically what it is?
Yes. Well, let me tell you what, because God really had me in Genesis for an entire year, I think, because I've always looked at that the same way. Well, God rested, so we should rest. As far as that was what that whole concept was. And probably about day 260 something into that year of Genesis, and I really just felt like I could not be released from that portion of the Bible. Finally got to the point where I was like, God, what are you trying to show me in this that I am just not getting? Because there's something obvious that I'm missing that I need to get a bit deeper understanding on. So I went back to that portion of scripture. And as you know, on the creation story, we all know, day 6, man was created. And then we see on day 7, God rested. And then for the first time, kind of this thought hit me. What was man doing while God was resting? And then I started kind of scrummaging through the scripture to find out kind of how things were laid out, the sequence. There really isn't any mention of work until the next chapter. In day 6, God told them who they were, kind of gave them their mandate, commissioned them. And then after that was the day of rest, is when God rested. And then man doesn't do any work until the next chapter comes up. And it was as if all of a sudden it finally dawned, it kind of clicked. We have all been kind of conditioned from our culture to see rest as the thing we do at the end of our work. We rest when our work is done. But the actual biblical basis of how this is laid out is at the very first portion, God is kind of speaking into them who they are and what work they are to do. But before they ever do the work, they enter a full day of rest.
Wow.
And then the work comes. So rather than work to earn our rest, we should have that completely flipped around to work out of our place of rest, because that's how you pour out of your overflow and not constantly be pouring out of your overwhelm and your fatigue and your drained situation many of us find ourselves working in.
Wow. I've never thought of that. That is fascinating. That will change your life and your approach. Okay.
It did mine.
Did it?
Because I've always thought if I work enough, then I can earn my rest. But when I look at it as to do the work God's called me to do, the way He wants me to do it, it has to originate with Him.
Interesting. So did you notice when you made that adjustment and just how you approach things, did you see a significant difference or feel a difference? What was sort of the biggest impact on your life?
It changed really how I looked at rest. I've always been kind of a workaholic type A type personality, so I can really relate to your dad. I've always saw more importance in the doing and the finishing and the goal setting and the production of things. That was where I put all of the significance. And so when I got this revelation of what rest really means and where it should be in that paradigm, I started stopped neglecting rest like I had. Rest was always, if I get around to it, great. If I don't, who cares? I can still get it done. But when I started seeing that the work that was produced was at a whole different level, I didn't do it and feel like exhausted at the end of it. I felt energized and ready to do whatever it is I was called to do and asked to do in those moments. And it got me to a place where I valued the rest and I started seeing it as sacred. This was my time with God. This was my time to sit with Him, partner with Him in the work, not ask Him to come along after the fact and help bless it, throw a blessing on it after I've birthed it, the Ishmael, but to actually stay there long enough with Him in intimacy, because really rest is about intimacy and trust. To stay there long enough in that place with Him that when I move out into whatever work He's called me to do, I feel like I'm in alignment with Him, that I'm part of the vine. I'm in the place that I need to be to actually do the best work that I can do.
Okay, now that's key, and I think that goes right to the title of your book, Sacred Rest. We're talking to Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, and when you put it that way, and I've heard this before, Robert Morse has a book that touches on this too. I've spent a lot of time, or maybe a whole day at work, and felt like I got nothing done, nothing meaningful done. How important is it for us to understand that quantity doesn't equal quality, and that really it's a productiveness is really tied to the quality of what we're doing, not just the amount of activity we're creating.
Yes, that's a culture shift. For for most of us, we are kind of goal driven. So the quality is so much easier for us to say, well, look what I did. I did this and this and this and this and this,
Mm.
and you feel like you really accomplished something. And we're not as mindful of the quality of the work that we necessarily put out. And not just the quality as far as how others look at it, but the quality as far as how we look at it. Was it our best?
Mm.
Or did we just get it done? Did we just check it off the list?
Mm-hmm.
Because really, to feel like you did a good job, you have to feel like you put your all into it. And for most of us, we don't even have our all to put into it because we're showing up already in a place of deficit.
Now, I had 4 children and a wonderful wife who amazingly raised them all. They're all within 5.5 years of each other. I saw, and still see it, a lot of families that get very, very busy, and they think that they're doing more by being involved in every activity at school and the club sports and maybe church even. I mean, that it even covers, good things like church. And it's like, do they ever slow down and take some time to sit with each other and really just spend some time where you're not busy, but you're having some, my parents' phrase, quality time, you know? Is that a common problem you're seeing out there? It seems to be very pervasive in our culture.
It is, and it comes back to one of the other types of rest, social rest, which is the rest we receive when we are around life-giving people. And the issue with social rest is social rest, for most of us, we experience it most when we actually have eye-to-eye time with people. So it's not the same as, we have social media where we can interact with people, but we don't get that eye-to-eye kind of contact. Now, you can get it on things like Zoom and Skype where you're kind of one-on-one or a couple of people, and you can see their body actions, you can hear their voice inflection, you can see a smile or a frown or whatever it is that's happening as you're having conversation. But there's a level of presence and understanding that helps people that helps them feel like accepted and understood, appreciated even. And so that social rest has become a large issue for many families, not only because we don't spend time eye to eye, but because we replace that time with our gadgets. All of us have been at restaurants where, everybody around the table has their phone out and nobody's looking at anyone, talking to anyone. We have couples that a lot of times, marriage is a huge area where the enemy likes to come in and infiltrate. And I find that a lot of couples, when we kind of talk through the social rest part of it, they don't spend time eye to eye anymore. And when they are eye to eye, it's because they're fighting or in some other kind of deep situation. But the problem with that is most of us fell in love with our spouse eye to eye. You spend time across from a table or sitting together talking, and then you get married and your eyes are towards the TV or your laptop or your phone, and it's not eye to eye. So we have to get back to an understanding of the importance of that social rest that comes in the presence, the eye to eye intimacy presence of someone who really understands you and accepts you and gets you.
Yeah, boy, man, again, so true. You mentioned the social media and how that can interrupt the eye to eye, but are there other ways that the sensory overload can detract from our rest? And I worry about this. I don't know. Maybe my kids are great at managing it. It was so different from when I grew up to now that I almost don't know how to address it with my children. Like, put the phone down or whatever. Is all this information age that we're in creating any rest issues that you're seeing?
Well, all of the electronics and gadgets certainly do add to our sensory overload. Sensory rest is needed after sensory overload. And for many of us, we're sensory overloaded even when we don't think about it. So yes, it's the social media and all of our electronics. It also comes into play with just the amount of news sometimes that and the TV that we're watching, the bright lights, the lights from our electronics. We don't always think about the blue lights that from just the things that we're using. Sounds. If you're working in a building that has a lot of phones going off, or if you're a stay-at-home parent with a lot of kids screaming right now, or even laughing and playing. There's so many times that we can get overloaded sensory-wise without really even recognizing it. And the problem with that is many of us manifest sensory overload in different ways. I'll give you an example. If you've ever had a 2-year-old who had a birthday party and they were perfectly great like the first hour, maybe even 2 hours of the party, and by the end of the party they are screaming their head off and just beside themselves, that's sensory overload. Yeah. Now take that person, add about 15 years, now they're a 17-year-old playing 3 hours of a video game where they are shooting people and strategic playing, and they walk out of their room and they are, mad at the world. Same thing. Take a grown-up who's in an office space who, spends all day in front of a computer or talking to people and hearing background noises, hops in their car and flips on the radio the whole way home, and then gets home and starts yelling at their family for what appears to be no apparent reason. They're just on edge. It's all the same process. Different ages, same process. It's all what sensory overload looks as kind of we mature and go throughout our years. And it all comes back to really getting back to an appreciation of silence. Yeah. Some of us haven't been in silence in so long that when it happens, it's almost weird. It feels scary even to go in, to be in a silent place. Many people don't even sleep in silence anymore because it's such a foreign atmosphere to them.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. My son moved out last week, and it's been real quiet with just me and my wife in the house. My wife used to say to my kids when they were young, when she got the sensory, she'd say, "Mommy's ears are tired."
That's a good one.
Mommy's ears are tired. This is fascinating. I want to ask. The book is obviously out and available, and I'll show that again. Sacred Rest, and I understand the sacred part of it now. I get that. But I understand that you have an easy way for people to kind of assess themselves.
Yes. As a physician, I think that was a huge portion of it for me, is to help people to be able to really do a little bit of self-diagnosis about which of these 7 types of rest they were most efficient in. I found that after kind of sharing that there are 7, the very first comment I would typically hear is, "Oh my goodness, she just gave me 7 more things I got to add to my to-do list." No, that's not how this works. You're already doing these things to some degree. But usually there's 1 or 2 types of rest that you've either never heard of, or you've never thought about how it affects you or how you should get more rest in these areas. And that's what the quiz helps with. The quiz helps you be able to determine which of the 7 types of rest you're most efficient in, so you can then focus your attention on getting rest in the area of your actual deficit. And it's really easy. It's at restquiz.com, and takes about 5 or 7 minutes or so to run through the questions. I always say you can't fail it. It's an assessment. So you don't have to try to get the answers perfect. It's just a matter of really answering them truthfully, so you get a really great assessment of where you're at.
And what will that tell people? What will that help them with? That's restquiz.com. What will they know at the end of that?
At the end, they get a score of all 7. They will see where they fall in all 7 types of rest. And there's a guide that lets you know if you're falling in this range, then you're good, or you're falling in this range, this may need some work. And it helps them to see kind of what each of the 7 types of rest mean. Just a quick kind of one, obviously I can't fully describe all 7 within that, but it's just a kind of quick one-liner of what each of the types of rest are, so that if you end up seeing that you have a spiritual rest deficit, what does that mean? And you can see what that relates to it, and then go deeper at that point.
When you see people take this test, do you find most of them at the end of it go, "Yeah, I knew that," or are people surprised?
Most people are surprised. And the reason being is because most of the time they didn't even think that was a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, oh, I'm deficient in sensory rest. And then when they read it, they're like, yeah, I do need rest in that area. And
Interesting.
it's very interesting because sometimes people really don't, they've been tired for so long and they just feel like this is just how life is. I've tried to get 8 hours of sleep. That didn't work. I'm still tired. So apparently, and my doctor says nothing's wrong with me. You know, it's not my thyroid, it's not my adrenals. They can't find a reason why I'm tired. Maybe this is just how I feel.
Hmm.
And then once they're able to identify which of the 7 types of rest they're deficient in, the number one thing I tend to get an email back is not necessarily about, I didn't know this was, this was what it would be. It's usually more along the lines, I didn't know what a difference this would make. I didn't even
Hmm.
know it existed. And now that I'm actually being very intentional about doing restorative activities in my place of greatest deficit, I had no idea that this was even possible, that
Yeah.
I could feel this way again.
Wow, wow. Okay, restquiz.com. There it is. Take the free quiz, assess yourself so that you can feel better and work better and even rest better. Check out the book Sacred Rest by Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith. Dr. Smith, I sure appreciate all your insight. This has been actually very wonderful. I might have to go take a little quiz right after we're done with this. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you guys for hanging out. Share this. You know some people that need some rest, and maybe they don't realize they need it. But let's. This is good. This is healthy. So let's focus on some positive things in such a little bit scary right now negative world, and make some improvements. Don't let the world rob you of your rest. Thanks again for hanging out. Be sure to subscribe or follow, depending on where you're at. And we'll see you next time on Life Today Live.
Most of you all the time want what you want. You love yourself. What is a man profited if he